Hello and welcome to Tipsy Tolstoy, Russian literature for the inebriated.
I'm Matt Gerasimovich, PhD student in Russian Lit. This week, doomed to eternal torment as my downstairs neighbors continue to saw at whatever they're sawing on. Don't they know I have a very professional recording studio up here? Huh? Don't they?
I think you should go let them know.
I will.
They're interfering with art.
That's right.
Yeah, not our art, the art of Vasily Grossman, but...
Well, yeah. I mean, this isn't art.
No, this is covering art. Anyway, I'm Cameron Lalana, and I'm on the go. I'm Mr. On the Go this week. I've been traveling a lot in the last couple of weeks, and so as a side note, Stalingrad, definitely the book number one of our podcast being read in the most number of weird places, from on the road, rural California, on the BART, in San Francisco, in a hospital, just everywhere. So across multiple counties. I went to Nevada. I should have brought this to Nevada. It could have been a multi-state book, but
it could have been. Shoulda, woulda, coulda. This is a podcast where me and my good pal Cameron get to unwind from our week with some Russian literature and a drink or two. This week, we continue on the road to becoming a completely socialist realist podcast while we continue our series on Vasily Grossman's Stalingrad. We did part 1 last week, part 2 this week, and it's going to be a 10-parter, so, you calculate how many episodes that is. It's a lot.
It's going to be a lot, and we're really excited to get into it. I've been doing a lot of research on JSTOR, and every time I read an article, I see 3 more I want to read, so I've got a lot of information to bring in.
It's like the grad student cycle, basically.
Yeah. Well, before we get into talking about part 2 today, Matt, I got to ask you, what are you drinking?
I am drinking a little something from when I was down on vacation. I am drinking a First Street Wheat, which is a beer by Tin Mill Brewing Company down in Herman, Missouri.
Okay.
Absolutely tiny town. It's where me and Cameron want to get a billboard for the podcast because rural Missouri billboards don't cost anything, and we thought it would be really funny to have a giant Tipsy Tolstoy billboard.
And that is the main reason to do something.
Yeah, well, yeah.
Yeah.
We said we wanted patron support because we were going to, do more episodes and hire an editor, and we'll get to that. But first, wouldn't it be funny if we had a billboard in the middle of nowhere?
Yeah, exactly. That's what I think that'd be a really good use of the money.
Yeah, it would. But What are you drinking this week, Cameron?
Well, Matt, where I am sitting, it is 10 a.m. on a Wednesday, so obviously it's
heck yeah, brother.
Too early to drink beer, so I've got an espresso martini.
Which I deem just chaotic bougie energy.
Well, what else are you going to drink? I need caffeine, I need alcohol, so I don't need alcohol. I need it for the show. That was a bad sentence. I need caffeine.
And also for fulfilling the addiction.
Yeah, I do need to keep the shakes from affecting the microphone, but I've got a double pour of an espresso martini, so we're going to see where that takes us.
Good. Well, speaking of people helping us buy billboards and or editors, one of the two, we'll see.
Maybe an editor, definitely a billboard. But we'd like to give a quick shout out to our newest patrons, Sharon, Blake, and Haley. Thank you all so much for joining or subscribing or becoming a patron. I guess that's the technical term for it. Anyway, thank you all. It's super helpful. And actually it will be going towards an editor, so we can go to that 3-month, which now that we've reached that goal, starting with this episode, actually, we will be releasing 3 times a month, the first 3 weeks of each month. So look forward to that. We're excited to really get our nose to the grindstone on this one. But let's get into Stalingrad. Okay, so the context for today is going to be talking about Vasily Grossman. This week we'll be talking about his life from birth up until World War II, and next week we'll be talking about his life from World War II to the end of his life. Before we talk about Grossman, though, I want to bring up this week's book recommendation about World War II, which is going to shift our perspective away from the European theater over to the Pacific War. And we're going to be talking about John W. Dower's War Without Mercy, Race and Power in the Pacific War. So this is a book which more or less covers the history of the way that Japan and the United States saw each other, drawing on songs, slogans, cartoons, propaganda films, interviews, documents to talk about the perception that was had of each other. Not only the perception, but also the ways that realized itself in the real world. And the reason why I want to recommend this is because I think it's really important to look at the human dynamics of conflicts, and especially in the Pacific War, because I think all too often we have this, if you're familiar with the Pacific War at all. This kind of simplistic idea that the heroic Americans came in and fought off the awful Japanese, committing war crimes up and down. And, don't get me wrong, the Imperial Japanese military was committing a lot of war crimes. Like, I'm half Filipino, and my grandparents grew up during the occupied Philippines. So when I was a kid, my bedtime stories from my grandfather were my grandmother's village being burned down and her having to watch it while she was like hiding in a boat out on in the nearby lake or the sea just to avoid being killed in that, or family members being dragged to death or almost to death. And it was not, I didn't have like, I had a lot of, I had a lot of nightmares as a kid, I guess what I'm trying to say. But of course that extends to extensive Japanese war crimes in China and in Korea, many of which to today are not acknowledged by the Japanese government. But all the same, I worry sometimes that there's this kind of racist trope you'll see in geopolitics or history where there's this idea of, quote unquote, Oriental or Asiatic despotism or barbarity, which is somehow unknown to the white Western world. You might think that that's a dead trope, but I've seen it as recently as, within like the last 2 weeks. I honestly don't remember the context, but talking about European politics, and this commentator who was in some organization kind of marveled that the sort of like Asiatic barbarity could be seen in Europe. So it's something you still see used, this trope. And the reason why I think it's important to bring in this more nuanced perspective about how these attitudes are either created or extant attitudes are utilized by propagandists, especially in times of war, to frankly make anything permissible is important, because although the Imperial Japanese military did horrible stuff, like I won't say it's comparable to anything the United States did. Well, okay. That gets into a more nuanced discussion of the usage of firebombing civilians in Japan and the atomic bombings, but that's a different moral conversation. But just talking about like just daily interactions between people, which were really brutal on all sides, right? In the Pacific War, Edgar J. Jones, who was a war correspondent and a veteran writing in the Atlantic Monthly in 1946, would write, "What kind of war did civilians suppose we fought anyway? We shot prisoners in cold blood, wiped out hospitals, strafed lifeboats, killed or mistreated enemy civilians, finished off the enemy wounded, tossed the dying into a hole with the dead, and in the Pacific boiled the flesh off enemy skulls to make table ornaments for sweethearts, or carved their bones into letter openers. As victors, we are privileged to try our defeated opponents for their crimes against humanity. But we should be realistic enough to appreciate that if we were on trial for breaking international laws, we should be found guilty on a dozen counts. We fought a dishonorable war because morality has a low priority in battle. The tougher the fighting, the less room for decency. And in Pacific contests, we saw mankind reach the blackest depths of bestiality." I rigged this up not to create a sort of moral equivalence between the US and Japan in the war. Like I said, I obviously have kind of a bias because of family history in that regard. But it's important to examine these dynamics, especially ones that are kind of glossed over in a more heroicized version of what happened looking back on it, which often will overlook unsavory elements. The American internment of Japanese people in the U.S. and its legacy, but the way that was unevenly applied, and the way that Japanese Americans were interned and lost much of their livelihood, where at the same time that was not applied to German or Italian Americans. And I don't mean to imply that this should have been applied to Italian or German Americans, but it's you don't see the same calls for that. And it's worthwhile engaging with, because, I mean, even as recently as the last presidential administration in the U.S., I recall a talking head for the administration saying that the concentration camps for Japanese Americans during World War II should be put back into use as a place to imprison undocumented peoples in the U.S. So although it's a history which seems long dead, it's still, I mean, the camps are still there, and there are still people who think that they should be used, which is why I think it's important to look at how we look at questions of, as Dower puts it, questions of race and power, in this case in the Pacific Theater. Excellent read if you got the time. It's like 400-something pages, so it's a bit of a longer one, but I think I read it in probably just a couple days. So I think it's well worth the time. Okay, let's talk about Vasily Grossman. So Vasily Grossman was born in 1905 to Semyon Osipovich Yekaterina Savalievna in the town of Berdichev. Berdichev was part of the so-called Pale of Permanent Jewish Settlement, which was an area from 1835 until 1917 when the Soviets ended that practice. Jews were not allowed to leave this area without special permission, and that special permission oftentimes was only available to the rich and powerful, although Grossman's family were some of the ones who were able to get around this limitation. Although this fact was hidden during the Soviet era, he came from a fairly wealthy family. His parents had international educations, were multilingual. They met in Italy. His mother at that point, Yekaterina, was already married, but left her husband to marry Semyon. Although their relationship would not last, Grossman would always maintain a close relationship with his father. Frankly, he maintained a good relationship with both parents, although his mother would be the one who raised him because his father would go far east to continue his work. It should be noted that Grossman's father was politically active and was a member of the Russian Social Democratic Party and would become a Menshevik after the split between the Bolsheviks and the Mensheviks, and luckily for him, did not meet the fate of many other Mensheviks. Grossman himself was raised by his mother, who was really insistent about certain things. For example, taking him to Geneva and Switzerland for, I think, a year or maybe 2 years to make sure that he had fluency in French. By the time that he's 7 in 1914, they moved to Kiev for schooling. Now, Grossman and his mother would stay there through World War I and up until 1918, which his mother referred to as the horrible year when they lived with her sister because their apartment had been bombed. In the ensuing civil war, it was a rough time to be, well, anywhere really, but in Kiev, there were 14 changes of power, all sides committing atrocities when they came in, and Nadezhda Mandelstam would describe these horrible times as writing, "Blood flowed in every street, outside every home. Bullet-ridden corpses lying on the roads and on the pavements were a familiar sight to us all, but more than the bullets, we feared the indignities and tortures that could be inflicted before death." So Grossman would continue on his education, working after the war, and eventually returning to Kiev after time outside in a labor school, studying STEM subjects. At this time, he would meet Anna Matsyuk, who would later go on to marry, although their relationship at that time was short-lived because Grossman would be accepted into the Department of Chemistry in the Moscow University. And in the following year, Grossman went to Moscow to study and became completely enmeshed in the intellectual life. You have to understand, in 1923, 1924, although Lenin was already dead, the era of Stalin was still fairly far off, relatively speaking. So all the policies being put into place by government, these socialist ideas were being measured for the very first time, and everyone was debating what was the right path, debating with pleasure or excitement, as Varlam Shalamov notes. He calls it a boiling cauldron of debate. But at the same time, although the socialist society is attempting to be implemented, you're still kind of in a sort of capitalist society. You remember in 1921, Lenin had introduced the new economic policy, which reintroduced elements of what we'd understand to be capitalist manufacturing because of the drastic drop in industrial output, which is attributable to a lot of reasons, but of course you can understand why a country coming back of a civil war is having some problems with the industrial output. So when Grossman's a student here, he actually is having a real tough time. He couldn't even afford rent, actually, and so he slept on the floors of his friends' apartments. And it was this perennial homelessness, which, although he kept a humorous bent to it when explaining it to his father, would weigh on him. He wrote in later years, in 1928, a few years after this, "You know, at dusk, I experienced what our savage ancestor in the forest in the Stone Age experienced. Having to look for shelter, I'm seized with anxiety. The ancestor was better off. He would climb a tree or crawl into a cave or a crevice. My situation in the primeval forest of the big city is worse. All cracks and caves are occupied, and I have to negotiate. Would you let me in for the night?" Years into his education at this point, he's not losing his passion for sciences, but he is growing more distant from it, and he's growing a passion for social issues. And luckily for him, his cousin, Nadia Almaz, who is about 8 years his senior but was raised in Berdichev as well, is the personal secretary and advisor to the head of the Trade Union International at that time, and she's able to secure him journalistic jobs, including, after a 2-month stay in Uzbekistan, publishing in Pravda, which is one of the biggest papers in the Soviet Union at this time. Around the same time in 1928, Grossman also gets married to Anna Matsyuk, as mentioned earlier, who his parents were not super big on. Hanna was still in Kiev at this time, while Grossman's in Moscow, and Grossman now going distant from his friends, and in his 6th year of university, he was really alone. And he begins to think about questions of life and death and getting really into Tolstoy. Like, really into Tolstoy. So after finishing his practicum, he moves back to Kiev and settles in with Galia, who is pregnant, and begins to work. And in 1930, Hanna gives birth to their daughter, Katya, but they would only be together for about 7 months before Grossman would leave to work at the Donbass, which is where he worked as a chemist in a gas laboratory. And he was not taken seriously here, although his job was to save lives and he looked upon their toil as heroic. He was looked on as almost kind of an annoyance by the miners there. And it was these experiences that he would turn into some short stories, including Phosphorus, and would also use it as the basis for one of his later books, Stepan Kolchugin. After about a year there, in this intensely lonely time, he begins to develop TB, and his father steps in and arranges for his son's transfer to an institute of pathology and occupational hygiene in Donetsk. The first thing that struck him there was boredom about his work. At the same time, it should be noted that Grossman would witness firsthand the effects of the Holodomor being the massive famine that took place in Soviet Ukraine due to the consequences of collectivization in the region, which would lead to the deaths of some number of millions of Ukrainian people there. Around the same time, Grossman's relationship with his wife is kind of falling apart. In 1932, Hanna and him would divorce, and he would begin to write more about his year at Smolyanka 11 in the Donbass region. And I'll read Popoff's quote in full here, although it's rather long, because this is as Matt mentioned in the last episode, this interaction between the two would be something that's actually relevant in Stalingrad, which we're reading now. After reading Grossman's work, Gorky would write back. Gorky, of course, was a proponent of socialist realism, which embellished reality. Naturalism was the trait of photographers, he explained in the same letter. This method could not be applied to Soviet reality. Moreover, it distorted Soviet reality. The author says, I wrote the truth. He should have asked himself 2 questions. First, what sort of truth? And second, why? The dirty truth of the past has died, and a new truth has been born. The author can see well the truth of the past. He truthfully depicted the dull-wittedness of coal miners, their drunkenness, brawls. Of course, all this is truth, but it's a very bad and tormenting truth. Gorky was teaching Grossman the ropes of socialist realism. Grossman should ask himself, why do I write? What kind of truth do I assert? Grossman is a gifted man and should be able to resolve these questions. Gorky's didactic letter was, in fact, an invitation to rewrite and resubmit Glukauf. Grossman would do just that. Glukauf being the book that Grossman would write in after his year in the Donbass region. When the book finally came out in 1935, it was praised for its accurate depiction of mining and metalworks, especially by, it should be noted, one of Matt's favorite authors, Isaac Babel. So if you're paying attention to the timeline here in 1935, it's about to be not a great time to be in an intellectual position in the Soviet Union. Grossman's cousin, Nadia Almaz, who had secured him many of his earlier jobs, would be arrested and expelled to Astrakhan for 3 years because of her correspondence with a close political acquaintance of Trotsky's. At the same time, Grossman would quit his job at the pencil factory he was working at the time to become a full-time writer, which actually paid him more than his engineering work. He would write more, including the short story In the Town of Berdichev, which was published to the acclaim of Babel again, Bulgakov, and even Gorky was a big fan of this one. Gorky praised the story and invited Grossman to his residence. Popoff writes, Gorky had a great respect for Jewish people and their historic role. Having witnessed a pogrom in Nizhny Novgorod in 1887, Gorky believed in the need to fight anti-Semitism by introducing the Russian reader to Yiddish literature and literature by Russian Jewish writers. Around the same time, Grossman would begin an affair with Olga Mikhailovna Guber, who was married to a friend of his, and in the following year, Olga would leave her husband in order to be with Grossman. Again, like I mentioned, in this same era, the writers' community from 1936 onward would begin to be hit pretty hard by the purges. About 2,000 writers being arrested, and only about 500 of them returning to public life afterwards. Writers like Mandelstam, who was arrested and sent eastward before dying on the way to the camps. Isaac Babel, of course, was arrested and would be shot in, I believe, 1940 or maybe 1941. Around this time, Grossman and Olga, her husband was arrested and shot. And they had this horrible summer where they were just waiting for their own arrest because, of course, Olga being married to an enemy of the people, well, it's not long before they come for you too. So after his execution, they wait for their arrest, and in February of 1938, it happens. The police arrive at Grossman's flat on Hudson Street, although they seem to be unaware that Olga and her ex-husband Guber were divorced. And Grossman, in just, wow, what a move, argues that they could not proceed with the arrest because they were unaware of that, and he was persuasive enough that they felt the need to consult their supervisor by telephone. Of course, the supervisor told him to go ahead with the arrest, which he could not stop, and Grossman immediately moved after that to obtain legal guardianship of Olga's sons, to prevent them being sent to an orphanage where enemies of the people, or the children of enemies of the people, were sent. Which, again, notable that he was adopting, children of one man who'd been shot and one woman who'd been arrested as enemies of the people. That's really going out on a limb at this time. And he, in fact, wrote many letters to people to ask for help for Olga, including to the man who was instigating the purge at this time, Seryozha, which is, Grossman would later be interrogated, but was surprisingly not arrested, actually. And even more surprisingly, only about 2 or 3 months after Olga was arrested, she was released. This suggests, because this is such a rare occurrence, especially that this is in 1938, which is the height of the purges, it suggests that there was help from someone somewhere in the apparatus, somewhere probably high up, although there's no evidence that points to anyone in particular. Grossman's own writing at this time would reflect many of his later approaches to literature, which fictionalizes events, but also brings a sense of humanity into it, in writing the story Mama, which fictionalized the real events of the Seryozha's adopted daughter Natalia, who was perhaps, as Popoff notes, the only person in the Soviet Union who left the Seryozha, the era of Yezhovshchina, with good memories of Seryozha. In this era, although Grossman's own family was suffering horribly, his uncle David in Berdichev was arrested and shot. Nadia would be, after her 3 years of exile in Astrakhan, would be arrested again and would eventually live in internal exile northeast of Moscow. He's doing okay. I mean, Olga, although was arrested, was released, which is incredible for that time period. He starts publishing Stepan Kolchugin in installments, which is released to favorable reviews. Things are going relatively well for Grossman, although, of course, the things would change in 1941 when Nazi Germany invades the Soviet Union. And we'll talk more about that next week, because I've been talking too long about this already. But that's broadly Grossman's life up to World War II. Of course, I've left out a lot of fine details. It's impossible to tell a whole life in just 20 minutes. So again, highly would recommend that you read Alexandra Popoff's book, Vasily Grossman and the Soviet Century. I believe I mentioned in our last episode. I'll link it again in the show notes in this episode. It's been what I've been using very heavily for research for this episode, in addition to other writings of Grossman, so would highly recommend it. It's a very well-researched and interesting read, too. But yes, that's Vasily Grossman. So let's get into part 2 of Stalingrad, starting with chapter 19.
Please.
Yes.
I'm dying to hear it.
I'm dying to get into it. So today we'll be covering in part 2 from chapter 19 to chapter 34. So last time we left the family with Seryozha, who has just volunteered for sort of a youth labor brigade, and the family having some arguments over that. And in the middle of the night, the family is awoken to the sound of cars and alarms and just movement in the city, and they all begin to wonder, hey, are we what's going on? Are we evacuating? What's happening? Marusia's husband, Spiridonov, goes outside and goes to overhear some of the soldiers who are now on the street, and he comes back in and declares to his family, well, comrades, we are a frontline city, the Southwestern Front. And the Southwestern Army has retreated into Stalingrad. At this point, an officer named Novikov, shows up a little bit later, knocks on the door, and asks to speak with Zhenya. I don't know if we mentioned this, but briefly, Zhenya, who was previously married to a Communist Party apparatchik named Krymov, while she was married to him, she met an officer named Novikov, and they kind of had like a will they, won't they, but over the course of like a single day. And he promises to write her, and they meet once or twice after Zhenya divorces Krymov, and they have this kind of connection, but every time after they have that connection, Novikov has this tendency to disappear. And once again, he walks back into her life and begins to chat with her. And of course, it's the middle of the night, and almost immediately after arriving, he's almost embarrassed of his presence there. And he tries to leave, but Zhenya's like, no, it's the middle of the night. You just stay here. We'll talk in the morning, whatever you want to say. And for now, you go stay with Seryozha and Spiridonov, who are sharing a room.
Also, you already woke everyone up. You can't be like, never mind.
Yeah, it's too late now. Once you knock on the door, it's, you got to commit.
You got to commit.
Yeah. While Seryozha, Spiridonov, and Novikov talk, which is a little bit of a stilted one. Novikov is not super friendly. Seryozha feels a strange sense of, import being there. Grossman writes, in the presence of this stern son of the war, Seryozha felt puny. Yet he too would soon be a son of the war. Reflecting, of course, that pretty much everyone here is, everyone there will be a part of the war once it becomes a siege, but even as it stands, Seryozha is about to join a labor brigade. So throughout, once they go to sleep, actually the next morning, Novikov ends up, they chat in the morning, and Novikov leaves and promising that he'll be back in a day or two. But of course, it's Novikov, so he does not come back in a day or two.
Unbelievable.
Well, actually, maybe quite believable for Novikov at this point.
No, yeah. Yeah, you're right.
So at this point, we begin to dive more into Novikov's history and him as a person. And Grossman describes Novikov as such. Others saw Novikov as excessively cerebral, and he was well aware what gave them that impression. He was calm and restrained in argument and meticulous about everyday matters. He got irritated if others infringed on his routines, and he never infringed on these routines himself. He was capable, during an air raid, of reprimanding a cartographer for not sharpening his pencil properly, or of saying to a typist, I asked you to stop using that typewriter that does such faint T's. So he's very particular, but he is an officer who is in high demand because of that. We delve into the first days of the war, or actually starting a few days before the war when Novikov was out far west, and he's hanging around a town out there. I don't remember if I have the exact name of the town written down here. Got a lot of notes. But on the days before Nazi Germany invades, there's a strange feeling about the whole town. There's a Nazi officer in the town who Novikov notes has this strange presence. He's almost more like mythological than man, and everyone around him feels that. All the peasants in the town, all the other officers feel wary around this Nazi officer. But Novikov is still going about. He's visiting gardens in the area. He's going to various mess halls, asking questions of people. But while he's waiting for the reason he actually has been called out that far east, in the middle of the night, Germany invades. And we follow through the next couple of chapters the absolute chaos of the first day, of Novikov running, of him trying to get to somewhere where he can get orders, of trying to find someone who's in command. We see the first few hours of combat when soldiers are just running and just putting up fights wherever they can. And what is essentially at this point just a losing battle of just how long can they fight before they're pushed back. And it's every point of it is a desperate fight where essentially the life is measured in minutes. At one point he notes watching some pilots who've just gotten up in the sky, and German, I want to say they're Messerschmitts, but German fighter planes are flying overhead and strafing civilians in the ground. And this one pilot gets up, and many others have been shot down even as they're trying to get into the sky. And he is able to almost shoot down one plane before another appears behind him to shoot into his plane and send him spiraling out. And Novikov notes, everything in the young man's consciousness, hatred, suffering, the longing to defeat death, everything in the man's eyes and heart was conveyed to the men down below by the death throes of his plane, which I think more or less conveys the attitude of what's going on. So Novikov escapes. He finds chief of staff. They're trying to give orders. They're trying to find their battalions. Communications breaking down. In large groups and masses, civilians are just running in every which direction. There are attempts to evacuate them, but it's not going well, and people are just fleeing. It's absolute chaos, as you might imagine. And Novikov sees, as he calls it, the hidden depths of many of the men around him, of men who he once thought to be mediocre, now morphing into hardened men who just give orders and carry out, and gregarious ones who seem the life of the hero, now suddenly breaking down and seeming lost in the face of this invasion. So we carry through with this scene for quite a while. Novikov stays on that front fighting for quite a long time, and that's from 1941. We follow him a year forward into mid-1942, where the Soviets are, at this point, retreating often, and at this point they've just lost almost the entirety of the Socialist Republic of Ukraine. And the Southwestern Front HQ has just retreated all the way back into Stalingrad, which is where we kind of joined in Chapter 19. And the front is changing so rapidly that Novikov is finding it difficult, even for his somewhat elevated talents, to keep track of it, because there's so many information sources, people saying, we've lost this front, we haven't lost that front. And he's got a map, and every hour almost, he's getting new reports and having to change it, and it's almost impossible to tell where the real front is, and it's hard for him to give his reports based on that. We jump back into kind of from the bird's eye view of the war back into an individual view as Novikov is summoned to a briefing with General Timoshenko, who is the general on this front. And at this point, we are really following the mood of the officers as they're trying to deliver the good news they have, even though it's very little. In Timoshenko, which this chapter is a lot of ways kind of a profile of the way he treats his officers, of Timoshenko being someone who is usually pretty hard on his officers, but at this point is almost genial, jovial with them, because he's got no desire to reprimand men who are already this beaten down by having retreated all the way to the Volga. At some point, one of the officers blames a battalion for having pulled back, which led to a retreat. And Timoshenko kind of remarks, so it was Chistikov who made us retreat, was it? Said Timoshenko with a smile. And here I was thinking that it was the enemy.
That's a pretty good zinger.
It was a very good zinger. So Timoshenko has managed to avoid turning this retreat, which has been a massive one, into a rout, which is militarily a victory. But the narrator notes that although it was not a rout, the real loss there was not something visible, was not a material thing. It was really in the morale of the troops, who just feel awful. Many of them have died on this retreat. It's been painful to come back this far. And as they reach the Volga, Timoshenko and many of the soldiers, thousands of them, begin to bathe in there, because they've been marching miles and miles for days and weeks, and the dust is so thick on their feet that it notes that it's like walking on sandpaper. And as they bathe, the narrator notes, "We do not know Marshal Timoshenko's thoughts. We do not know whether he or any of these thousands of men throwing water over themselves understood that they were performing a symbolic ritual. This mass baptism, however, was a fateful moment for Russia. This mass baptism before the terrible battle for freedom on the high cliffs of the west bank of the Volga may have been as fateful a moment in the country's history as the mass baptism carried out in Kiev 1,000 years earlier on the banks of the Dnieper." And further going on to say, "Should future historians wish to understand the turning point of this war, they need only come to this shore. They need only imagine a soldier sitting beneath this high cliff. They need only try, for a moment, to imagine the thoughts of this soldier as they look back at the cliff line behind the city and realizing that they will be fighting. They will be moving all the way into the steppe at this point, having lost a great deal of the Western Soviet Union."
That's a great scene.
Great. Such a cinematic scene too.
It does such a good job of, like I said, oscillating between the baptism of the entire army, but then prompting you to imagine just the individual specific soldier.
Yeah, that is where this sort of complex ability to capture all sorts of all forms of characters really where Grossman shines, and that's something I really want to talk about a little bit later on.
Yeah, definitely.
Especially in comparing a later departure from a family to that of Vavilov's in the first part. Mm-hmm. So at this point, we go from this large army perspective back into the family that we started with, and we rejoin Ludmila Nikolaevna, who I'll remind you is the eldest daughter of Alexandra. The order going Ludmila, the oldest, Marusia, the middle, and then Zhenya, the youngest. So Ludmila, as a quick reminder, we'll go through a lot of family stuff because there's a lot of family members. And at this point, I've got like a pretty good map of them in my mind, but that's because I'm 200 pages in and I've been writing out family maps. Ludmila is the mother of Tolya, who is a soldier, and the mother of Nadia, who is still not in Stalingrad at this time. And she's married to Victor Strum, who is a physicist.
I like that they do also get into a fight over how complex her family is as well.
Oh, that's that. I almost forgot to bring that up. Thank you for bringing it up. Yeah, that's something that later, like Ludmila and Victor will note that they had arguments about.
I was like, great, finally some vindication for me, the reader.
Wait, it's the other way. It's Victor. Victor's family is really complex, and Ludmila can never remember. And and then Victor says, no, it's really simple. And he's like, there's a long paragraph that says, this is the uncle of this, and then the uncle of that, he is married to her, and then she's the, it goes on, and then he's like, it's very simple, and she shakes her head and
simple,
walks
really.
off. Yeah. So it's noted that although Ludmila had studied for a doctorate in chemistry and was quite talented, she ended up getting caught up in her life after her second marriage of managing gardens and houses and her two children, and she never ended up finishing it. In the early days in school, she got married as a first year to a man named Abarchuk, and Abarchuk is just a through and through young communist student. He fought in the Civil War. He's completely upright, he's sort of a, I don't know, he's sort of a Rakhmetov type character almost, where he's completely upright, completely within the lines of who he feels he should be. He's completely against any form of bourgeois behavior, even treating it almost like a physical virus. It's written that anyone of bourgeois origin inspired him a sense of physical disgust. If he happened, in a narrow corridor, to brush against a pretty, elegant girl student whom he suspected of being bourgeois, he instinctively shook his arm, as if to remove any least trace of her from the sleeve of his military jacket.
And let me just say, ladies love when you do that.
Well, Ludmila apparently loved it for a time.
For some reason, yeah.
Yeah, so Alexandra was not super happy about this marriage, but it does go through, and they're married from her first year to her third year. And it's like, okay, even though she's kind of a bourgeois background, Abarchuk overlooks it for the most part, until the birth of their son, Tolya. At that point, Abarchuk, his belief is, okay, the Tolya, he'll be raised by like group, we'll be sending him to a home, and then we'll continue on as students, and then Ludmila is like, no, I kind of want to keep him. And so she like starts knitting clothing for the kid and taking care of him. And Abarchuk just gets mad whenever he sees her like doting over the baby or cooking for him. And he's like, this is totally bourgeois. I cannot allow it.
Stop caring for your child. I will not have this.
And when Ludmila ends up leaving over the summer break to go stay with her family, Abarchuk writes her a letter and says, this isn't working out. I can't be married to you. And when she comes back, he greets her just like a comrade. He tries to shake her hand, and she's not super happy, as you might imagine, and ignores him.
And then he also tries to get her purged later, so that's fun.
yeah. So
That's fun.
Like a year later, he tries to get her excluded from university when they're going through a series of purges from not leading to death in this case, but just excluding them from being students. But thankfully for her, it doesn't go through. However, there are two students who are, by this committee, excluded, although they're later brought back in based on the recommendations of teachers, one of whom is Victor Strum, who, through this process, Ludmila ends up becoming acquainted with, falling in love with, and then eventually marrying. We follow the sort of domestic life of Victor and Ludmila, as opposed to Abarchuk, who is very upright, very in control of everything. Victor he's kind of sheltered. His mother raised him alone. She took him through the world to make sure that he was getting educated, and he, as a young boy, had kind of free reign, and he went off and he was super in love with ponds and being outside and seeing the physical world and studying it. And his mother devoted her whole life to him. And even as a student, she is doting to the extent of sending him multiple care packages per year. Every week he writes her a letter, even at the end of every week, asking Ludmila to write a couple sentences to his mother, and Ludmila gets really annoyed at this, saying, I don't even write to my own mother this much. Who am I married to? You or your mother? But it's also this characteristic which seems to attract Ludmila to him, because she, as opposed to being married to Abarchuk, where she felt like a child all the time, she feels a bit more like an adult compared to Victor.
Which, well,
yeah. Look, we're not here to talk about relationship dynamics. We're here to
not yet.
Not yet. Well, I mean, not relationships dynamics. Like I would talk to a friend of like, maybe that's not the best way to relate to your husband, but they're fictional characters. So we follow Victor through more of his impetus for studying physics and his desire to sort of build this bridge between theoretical research and make it relevant to the masses of workers in the Soviet Union and make it useful for them, and find a way to make it worthwhile. And it almost feels like, even though he feels a sense of rightness in what he does, it's always a little bit, it's driven by this kind of almost sense of loss, because he had a young friend many years ago who was also deeply in science, who joined the Red Army during the Civil War and ends up dying. And it's noted that Victor wanted to build a bridge that would bring together his theoretical research and the difficult, noble labor of the country's millions of workers. He remembered his friend Lebedev, who was the one who was killed in the Civil War, wearing the helmet of a Red Army soldier and with a rifle on his shoulder. This memory burned him. So at this point, we come back into a little bit before the original events of this book, and Victor and Ludmila evacuate from Moscow to Kazan in the early days of the war. But after some time, Victor and a colleague of his, Postayev, they're summoned back to the West in order to work on some projects. And we follow a little bit about their family dynamics, learn a little bit more about Victor's relationship to Tolya, which is always a little distant. They don't seem to understand each other. We learn about Nadia, who's sort of a sad, lonely girl who understands more about her parents than they seem to understand about themselves. Family conflicts over that. And then finally we come to Victor leaving, which is something I want to touch on more later. And it's so we go into extended, actually, just like an exact detailing of what exactly is going to his pack, which, as you might imagine, Ludmila is packing for him. And Victor is just kind of reminiscing about old times he had to flee elsewhere. And Ludmila notes that she feels Victor, was too casual about her well-being, and that he didn't appreciate all the trouble she went to over practical domestic matters. And Victor and his colleague, Postayev, get on a train and start heading west, all the time running into a lot of chaos and a scene of general disorder and people who have gotten lost and drunkards and all sorts of people in a great moment of portrayal of life, of the difficulties of people trying to find cheaper prices, discussing where they can go and buy the goods they need, the people who've been lost, and the reaction of people who have something in contrast to people who they frankly don't know how to help. And that was where we end chapter 34, which will be the end of part 2 of what we're reading for this episode.
And that was a great summary.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
So, okay. Wow, a lot happened. We are going deep into these characters, into Ludmila, Victor, and Novikov.
It's so interesting how the timeline works on this, because I was thinking about this now that we're like 200 or so pages into it. Grossman just drops you into present day and leaves you to struggle and grasp who the heck is who for like 20 pages. And then he'll be like, okay, fine, here's 80 pages of backstory. Would that help you contextualize? I think so.
Yeah, pretty much. Well, we'll start talking about a character, and then after, like for the case of Ludmila, we learn much about her early life, and then we get to the part where it's like, oh, she got married to Victor. We talk more about her married life, and it's like, oh, well, let's go back and talk about Victor's childhood now, too.
Yeah, it is. That's what I was saying on part 1, is I feel like I really need to read this a second time. It already feels like one of those books, because I'm going to have all this information that builds, but I have nothing, like I need to go back and reread it with that in mind to kind of, I feel like, pick out more details that will become even more interesting on our second read through, which, you know, hey, maybe one day we'll do a second read through on the podcast. Wouldn't that be a waste of time? No, it wouldn't. It would be better.
Yeah, something I think about a lot is when we were covering Anna Karenina, and you talked about the relationship between Anna and Stiva. What you said was that a lot of times in books, you're told that characters are siblings, and we accept that because, you know, okay, they're siblings. We've been told that by the narrative. But it's less common that you look at these characters and see the rhymes that you might see in siblings. Not necessarily, but like, okay, I see these common traits in you in the case of Anna and Stiva and the different ways they take those common traits. But it's like really fascinating to see. I think that's also true of Grossman, is that got this great way of having characters who you feel their family connections and their common background, and where there are divergences, why those divergences happen. Not least of all for, in like the case of all the sisters, and like the characters of their families, of their husbands, of their children, of the lives they've lived, and why that's taking them in such different directions. But it feels tethered. Like outsiders to the family, Novikov feels like an outsider when you're reading him interacting with the family, as opposed to like the relationship between, for example, Seryozha and Spiridonov, who would have a much more familiar, although somewhat strained, as you might imagine, from father to child, father being like a director of a factory and child being a headstrong young man who wants to go fight in a war. Yeah,
the way he switches point of view is kind of interesting. And then he also, so it's interesting because he really makes full use of like third person limited. But then when he kind of steps out to this grander narratorial style, he sometimes also limits himself. So you think he was going to step back and make a judgment, and then he's like, well, there's no way to know what he was thinking. I wouldn't know. No way anybody could know. Who's to say? Which is kind of fun.
That is such an interesting point, isn't it? So much of this book is examining the psyches of these characters, but also there are characters who are outside the narrative. The soldiers, they're outside the family narrative. Obviously General Timoshenko, they are they're present and they're there to be understood, but only externally, as if you're from the viewpoint of a member of the family almost.
Right.
Or I guess Novikov is also not a member of the family, but tangentially related to the family.
Yeah. And so to go back slightly to what you were saying about families and their unique characteristics, I think there's also an interesting thing where the kind of focus has started to shift a little bit to a couple of dichotomies that I see forming already in this part. Mm-hmm. And there's, of course, on the military side, there's a sort of simple versus complex. There's stationary versus fluid when they're talking about troops. But then even kind of on the grandest level, there is, I don't know exactly what you would call it, but there is this sort of, towards the end of where we were reading, there's a very, like, talk about a grand narratorial style that breaks in kind of out of nowhere, where Grossman's talking about people that get bogged down in the trivial nature of life compared to those who are aware of this unity that he says lies beneath them. And he really kind of chastises the people who don't have this sense of purpose, like this really overwhelming, like blinding sense of purpose. And he says that they can achieve small material successes, but they never win life's real battles, which is kind of interesting because to me, this is a pretty big condemnation of, Tolstoy, I guess, maybe. Where, I don't know, a lot of the end of Anna Karenina is, well, I don't know, maybe just get busy and do some housework and farm and stuff. And that'll be good. And then you'll die. And that's okay.
Right.
And so, yeah, there's kind of these things that are starting to emerge. And so not only are there similarities, to wrap it back to where I was originally going, down this long, windy road of thoughts, not only are there similarities between families, there's just this kind of these general similarities, very broad strokes of what it means to even be human. I think he's starting to sort of paint. And I think it's good. I like it. I'm a fan.
Yeah, actually, I want to build on that point about that sort of rebuke for a second, because that's interesting that you bring it up. Thank you, I appreciate it. It's interesting that you read that as a rebuke of Tolstoy, which I think is apt. When I was looking at that, I almost wondered if that was a sort of, looking back on Grossman's own past, a sort of reflection on his own troubled relationship to the Soviet state, as you might imagine. So that particular line is from a chapter which I skipped over, actually. It's talking about a man named Dmitri Petrovich Shapryshin, who was a teacher of Victor Strum's and was quite an influential one. And Shapryshin is kind of noted, he's almost like a titan among his fellow faculty members back at the college when Strum was a student. Whereas everyone else is kind of old and varicose and almost like decrepit. He's the same age, but he loves being out in nature. He hikes around. He's tan. He looks strong. He looks wind beaten. And there's a long, 3 pages maybe, of talking about the reason why he did what he did, which was not just for the love of science, but for the love of land, for the love of trees, for the love of people, for the love of the birds and the squirrels, for the love of just seeing something grow. And after all that very careful, loving description of a man who just seems to be completely in love with the land around him, then we come to, but he didn't have a concrete ideological view of the world. He just simply liked things. And without that ideological view, you can't get anything done. And we'll be in the last days of men like this, who they realize, oh my God, I have really achieved nothing because I was just in too many directions and I did not know how to direct my energies into, an ideological direction. And so obviously I don't know Grossman's thoughts, but for a man who was so engrossed in sciences, growing up and was forced into a lot of awkward positions by the circumstances of his life, I don't know, I can't read that without thinking of his own personal circumstances, whether or not that may not be the case, right? I've got no actual insight into that, into his own thoughts, obviously.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, and then at the end of that chapter, when him and Klimov are debating a little bit, he says you have to think a little bit more about how people with such a weak grasp of the theory of knowledge can be so very strong when it comes to actual knowledge. And so this is kind of setting up, I think, what seems to be so kind of like you're saying, it's sort of a dichotomy, but it's a little bit more nuanced, I think. And I don't exactly know what to make of it.
I think as we go more, there will be more development of that. Like you mentioned, Krimov, who is, of course, Zhenya's first husband. He pops up twice in this part, and both times to provide a reprimand to Victor about people in his life. The first time, Victor, who's a little bit insecure about Abarchuk, when he's kind of making fun of Abarchuk for being so straight-laced, Krimov says, well, keep in mind that was a man who fought and sacrificed and bled in the Civil War, whereas what were you doing? And then later on it appears again when Victor is praising Chapuzhin and kind of says, well, like what you said, he doesn't have a particular direction.
Did we mention Abarchuk was purged?
Oh, no, we didn't. I was thinking about that, though.
Well, that would be good. That's good context to know. Yeah. He was purged.
Yes, he would later go on to be purged, which was slightly before the war. After becoming a manager of factory, yeah, he is. Mm-hmm. Actually, several characters are not just like, students excluded from the faculty like in the earlier setting, but, arrested and disappeared.
Yeah, no, much worse than being like excluded and then reinstated into the university.
Yeah, yeah.
But yeah, so it's interesting. So you have a slight criticism of people who are not ideological, but then you have people who are overly ideological, and the interesting part being, of course, that is not rewarded by the state. Actually, quite the opposite. And then I'm pretty sure Ludmila's mom also criticizes him for that, saying something along the lines of, people like this have a hard time of reconciling their love for humanity with their love for an individual. And so it's a really complex way that he's trying to work out all of these feelings, I find.
Right. That sense of respect almost for like the heroism of fighting in the Civil War, which is kind of given to Abarchuk by Krimov, but I would say is much more strongly given to Lebediev, the friend of Victor's, who is like the memory of whom, him being a young scientist, but then before going off and dying in the war, being that memory that burns him and drives him onward to try to connect his work as a scientist to the work of the laborer.
Mm-hmm.
Do you mind if we go back to family for a second? Because I want to talk about a comparison to part one.
Sure.
So when Victor's leaving, Ludmila is packing his bags for him, and we go through, I would say, actually maybe 2 paragraphs of exact detail, of like the exact number of onions, the medicines she packs for him, the clothing, and her like explaining to him how to, almost as if he's a child, which frankly, given that he's just reminiscing about other times he's had to travel, seems pretty justified. But that contrast against Vavilov leaving his family in part one, where it's very solemn. There's a heaviness over all of them, which at least not least of all because Vavilov is being called up to the front to fight and Victor's just being called to work. So obviously those circumstances are different, but like the way in which I love the characterization of not only these individuals and their relationships, but the families as a whole and their relationship of, both like as an overlap, both of the Ludmila is annoyed at Victor, and unfortunately I forget Vavilov's wife's name, Vavilovna. She's annoyed at her husband, but that's really just to cover for the fact that she's worried about her own future.
Mm-hmm.
And she their deep care for each other, just it's very restrained. It's not very open. They've lived a hard life. They got married because they had to be, because they're partners and that's how they view each other. But that also comes with the care of, well, that's kind of my other half, for better or for worse. And then you get to Victor and Ludmila being like, stop acting like a child. But at the same time, and like her, and of course she was trained in chemistry, and you kind of see that like scientific mind almost being reflected in the text, being exact in even the number of onions. Whereas in like Vavilov leaving, it's like, oh, what do you want? Take the mittens, and him saying, no, you take the mittens, and quietly reflecting the fact that it would be wasted on him. And it's such a similar scene, but so it characterizes the families and the individuals so well, and it's just a remarkable piece of character building in both senses, both in the way they're portrayed, in the way the writing comes out. I just love it.
You know what's not a complex thought, but what I found hilarious?
Sure.
When Ludmila signs Nadia up to work at the kolkhoz for the entire summer, and then she throws a fit and says, no, then I have to go work all summer, and it's not comfortable, and it's a lot of hard work, and then I have to go right back to school. And Mom signed me up without even asking.
And then Victor goes to Ludmila, is like, you really don't have to, she's already such a thin child, you don't need to make her work anymore. And Ludmila is like, well, I was smaller than her when I was her age, she can stand a little hard labor.
That was a great scene.
It is pretty funny.
I kind of started to see, though, as well, the familial general similarity where it's not just I guess 19th century you have fathers and sons, and now we have mothers and sons here. Not necessarily conflict, but so when Ludmila is kind of what Victor thinks is coddling her son Tolya, he reprimands Ludmila saying, I was never coddled like that. And then the narrator breaks in to go, except he was coddled exactly like that. But he just doesn't think he was. And so there's kind of this like general description of what is ordinary in family life. And then you have this feeling that a lot of people have about what is extraordinary. And so it's noted several times that Ludmila feels like her love for Tolya is extraordinary and nothing can compare to it. And then she talks to her mother about whether it's her first husband or son or whatever it is. And her mother's like, yeah, no, everybody has that. And the narrator notes that in a lot of these cases that he describes the individuals who feel that they're doing something extraordinary, actually what they're doing is incredibly ordinary. And that's not to denigrate what they're doing, but I think it's actually to show that within everybody actually has this potential to do something extraordinary. And so that's what I really think the defense of Stalingrad is about. But it's not just about the defense of Stalingrad, it's also about life. Because whether you're in war, actually on the front line or not, you still have this propensity to do something that is extraordinary. And I think that's a really optimistic message.
Yeah.
You think about that? Huh? Did you?
I didn't think about it. I think that's an interesting point. I like the sort of the almost heroic element too. I would say also just like also focusing in the ordinary element of like where of Grossman is writing a book about the siege of Stalingrad, which he notes is the changing point of the war, the changing point of the history of the Soviet Union, and he dedicates a whole page to an argument between a husband and a wife over Ludmila signing their daughter up for a work camp over a summer camp she doesn't want to go to. It's a very ordinary scene.
Well, let's not say summer camp. Let's say summer labor camp. Summer camp sounds fun. I don't know how much fun it would have been. Any of our listeners got to participate, let us know.
Yeah, but just to your point about the ordinariness of all of it at the same time. And there's like the ordinary hero there, I guess the ordinary dash heroic elements, and then there's just the ordinary elements of this, which I think bringing this all together is why this feels so. I mean, despite the fact that when you're reading this, you can like tell that like this is supposed to be a piece of literature which is uplifting to the reader. Of like, yeah, this feels like I love this place, I love this land, I love the Soviet Union, I love the Red Army, which also coexists alongside really true and authentic feeling and very touching feelings of touching examinations of family, especially during, in this case, wartime.
Sorry, I have more quotes to talk about. I was just flipping through and trying to find them.
Yeah, go for it.
We only analyzed like 10 pages, so.
This was only 100 pages, but this took me so long to read because every other page, I have a whole paragraph. I would just like copy down a whole paragraph from the book into this because, God, it's this like this. I just love this prose. I know we say that a lot, and it's only been 2 episodes, and you're gonna be really tired of us hearing that, but it's just such engaging prose.
I'm going to sell it on a shirt with a caricature of Cameron that says, "God, I love Grossman's prose."
Dude, I was at a bookstore the other day, and I was like telling myself, like, I'm not going to spend a bunch of money here. And then I saw they had an entire section on almost everything Grossman's ever written, and I
really
took all of my self-will. Yeah.
Well, of course you're going to say that before you go in because no bookstore carries everything by Grossman.
Yeah, no, usually. I walked in. It was City Lights in San Francisco. I walked in. They had Life and Fate, Stalingrad, Everything Flows, collections of his short stories.
Done. Purchased. Bank account destroyed. Shattered.
Yeah, I was. Oh God, there's. If you're ever in San Francisco, I'd recommend City. There's a bunch of stuff which I was like, I kind of want to bring this on the podcast. There's one which was, maybe you've heard of it. It's called was it a Man with Cocaine or something, which was written by a Russian emigre author to Paris shortly after the creation of the Soviet Union, written under a pseudonym about a man wandering through Paris being addicted to cocaine.
Let's do it. Let's read it.
Yeah. Anyway,
right now,
all kinds of weird stuff in that story of his. And when I saw the Grossman stuff, it just took so much self-will not to buy all of it.
Yeah, absolutely.
One thing, just a brief notice I want to mention. So when I was doing research for this, I I was on JSTOR, and like I said, I've been reading a bunch of other stuff, and one of the things which I think I mentioned last time, and I'll bring it back in again. This paper called "Brutal Games: Call of Duty and the Cultural Narratives of World War II." And you may wonder, what does that have to do with this? But one of the things that the author Debra Ramsay notes is that that the kind of way that we portray war in video games and sometimes media has a huge amount of erasure of civilians in it. And Ramsay writes, given that civilian casualties in World War II far outweighed the military casualties on all sides, the gradual erasure of civilians from spaces of war is perhaps one of the most critical absences in the visual construction of World War II, and it reaches the apotheosis in the FPS. In World at War, which is the 5th Call of Duty game, the spaces of war are entirely devoid of civilians, and the damage of war is evident only in the environment or on the bodies of soldiers. Although the game claims to reveal the more brutal aspects of World War II, the game limits this exposure to combatants and ignores the civilian face of suffering. 95,000 civilians died on Okinawa. However, the only death to register with any significance in the Okinawan campaign in the game is that of the player's mentor, Roebuck, or his squadmate, Polanski. That's something that Grossman absolutely does not shy away from. One of the major features of Novikov describing the first day in the early days of Operation Barbarossa, the Wehrmacht's invasion of the Soviet Union, is the masses of refugees who are uncertain, who call out to him and ask him what's going on, and he looks at them and genuinely doesn't know what to say. And even the things that he believes are, I think, as the narrator notes, are wrong. And also, as a side point, this book has such wonderful dry humor, where Novikov, even as he's retreating, he's trying to make things make sense in his own mind, and the only way he can make sense of it is to think about reports he wants to write. And the reports he wants to write are on when he hears battalions fighting back, he wants to say, well, from what I hear, battalions which got in contact with their command centers and received orders did better than battalions who did not receive orders. And I want to write a report on how it's really important that we maintain lines of communication, because that's the difference between beating back the Germans and losing entire battalions. And then the narrator breaks in to say, well, of course, that wasn't quite true, even though he would go on to write that report. In fact, it was the case that the ones who got in contact with the leadership had already survived. And in fact, no one had received orders, because orders are only effective when you have time to analyze things and know the situation. And in this situation, no one knew what was going on. So the men who were giving orders had no more idea than the men carrying them out. In fact, the men who simply acted rather than waiting were the ones who successfully beat back the Wehrmacht and were able to get in contact, rather than the other way around.
Yeah. He describes the war very often as having a logic of its own, which is an interesting way to view war. I mean, maybe not. Maybe it's general. It seems to be just in very stark contrast to the way that somebody who is professionally in charge of any aspect of military operations would probably like to see a war, which is to say that they have some control over it. And this whole book is essentially about how not really. You're kind of beholden to those ordinary things on everyday life that can cause things to, spiral out of control. That there's no way that it's possible to have command over. I mean, they're trying to even just look at like where is our army, and they're like, I don't really know. So to think that they would have some sort of control over anything on a micro level, like beneath that, is of course not really possible.
Yeah, I mean, that's something that Novikov is struggling with all the time, because people come to him because he's the one who's best at separating the wheat from the chaff, of getting all these intelligence reports. And there's actually this great scene where he talks about all the different sources of intelligence, scouts, and various other sorts of people who bring in information, as well as the Air Force. He says, well, he really prefers the Air Force because they're the ones who can get you the most active idea of battle lines. So, and then he kind of talks to his method for creating those most active lines, which is why, even though his superior officer, Bychov, appears to really not like him, is why Bychov is always blocking his transfer to other staff or becoming a frontline commander like Novikov would like to be, because he's seen as essential, if not entirely respected for that. And just the intra-office politics, too, of like Bychov trying to get rid of officers he doesn't like, and Novikov trying to stand up for them, and he's kind of in a protected position, because even though Bychov obviously does not like him, really understands that he needs Novikov. And every step of the book has at least when we're not zooming out for that kind of bird's eye view of like the general view of the army bathing in the Volga, like a really great granular view of life. Again, getting back to that ordinary view of, even in times of war, you can't get rid of office politics of a superior officer being like, this guy's annoying me. He's going to go back into rear line duty.
The last thing I wanted to talk about, very last thing, probably. There are just some weird conversations in this part.
Sure.
Or weird thoughts, just random thoughts. And there was this just really striking passage that I liked where Novikov was kind of wandering around before, kind of the night before the attack. And he's just kind of looking at the sky and the way it looks. And he says that at times like this, we cease to have distinct perceptions of light, space, silence, rustlings, warmth, sweet smells, the swaying of long grass or leaves, all the millions of ingredients that make up the world's beauty. What we perceive then is true beauty, and it tells us only one thing, that life is a blessing. And that was such an interesting quote for a book that dives into the millions of ingredients that make up the world's beauty, or at least attempts to dive into a few of those. It's very interesting, I think, as a sort of perception into, I don't know what you would call it. It's an interesting look, I guess, into Grossman's thoughts on beauty, art, and life, I guess. Probably the point of the book then, right, is to perceive some sort of beauty in this way that doesn't, it kind of, as a whole, when you're finished, it is to perceive some sort of beauty. This is my guess. It's not to perceive all of these things as distinct individual perceptions, but on the whole. And so this is how he creates art, and also, at the same time, it's kind of a very totalizing view of existence as well. I don't know. It's interesting. It's not a worked out thought. It's something I'm thinking about.
That's fair. That's something I'm sure we'll be developing as we go, because these threads are not left alone.
No, yeah, and we have so much more to read.
Yeah. Every once in a while, I'll look at this book and think, what could we possibly talk about when we sit down for another 100 pages? But then, at least so far, every time I sit down, I'm like, oh my God, there's too much to talk about in only an hour.
I know. That wasn't even all the quotes I had. That was like half.
Yo, yeah. Yeah.
But that's all I want to talk about for now. Those are my most developed thoughts.
A lot of half-grown ones, which we will address when the time is right, when the narrative brings us to a more complete place of understanding, I think.
Absolutely. And I want to encourage any of the readers that are reading along with us, shoot us an email. Let us know what you're thinking. And if we like your email, we'll read it on the end of the podcast and give you a little answer.
Yep. Or you can tell us something funny.
Or you can tell us something funny and I'll read that too. And it doesn't have to be about Stalingrad.
Okay. As loath as I am to leave it here, Matt, on a scale of 1 to Yeltsin, where are you? Where are you at 1 p.m. your time?
6. Not quite over the threshold, but I'm
sure
farther along than you should be for 1 p.m.
Yeah, that's fair.
Mm-hmm. How did you end up at 11 a.m. your time?
I think at my peak I was a 5 directly after I finished it, but it's been about 20 minutes since I finished off my martini, so I've come back down to like a 4, I think. So probably, I'm going to say reasonable for 11 a.m. Well, as reasonable as it can be for rating yourself on a scale of drunkenness at 11 a.m. when I have other things to do today.
Yeah, the weekday really throws it off, I think.
Yeah, but it's weird to record on a weekday. This is different.
It is different. That's what we get for procrastinating.
Such is life. Such is life and fate.
Such is life. Before we let you go, I wanted to extend a sincere thank you, me personally, not from Cameron, just from me, to all of our current patrons that are supporting the show. As you know, nothing pays well anymore or ever. Podcasting, grad school, it's all a wash. The only income I have now is from our patrons, who I am thanking, again, from me, not from Cameron. We have... Jeff, Madeline, and Janice, Daniel, Darren, Daniel, Jack, Paige, Jesse, Lou, Rini, Brandon, Allison, Cole, Elise, Mysterious Donor Dude, Joanne, Yitza, Alex, Stephanie, Julie, Eli, Caitlin, Brett, Isaac, Austin, Zachary, Packrob, Maya, Sharon, Blake, and Haley. Without all of our patrons, what would we do?
Yeah, what you all don't realize is that at the beginning of this podcast, I pledged to match every patron because I didn't expect us to earn any money. And Matt needs it because he goes to grad school.
I'm milking Cameron dry. It's it.
Yeah, so every new patron means that my paycheck goes smaller and smaller.
Cameron's working 7 jobs.
Soon 100% of my paycheck. Yeah. Soon 100% of my paycheck is just going to be funding Matt's video game addiction.
No. Maybe. Maybe.
Actually, no, take that back. It's not going to fund. It's going to fund your addiction to hobbies.
Yeah, that's more like it.
Yeah. Every week it'll be like, what am I funding this week?
Microgreens.
Microgreens, yeah.
Furniture restoration. Beekeeping.
Well, I still...
Is this funny?
It's a good bit. Well, I still have money before the repo people take my microphone away from me. The music used in this episode was Soviet March by Toasted Tomatoes. You can find more of their stuff on toastedtomatoes.bandcamp.com and also on YouTube under the same username. If you were looking for others, also follow us on Instagram at Tipsy Tolstoy Podcast or on Twitter at Tipsy Tolstoy, or join our email list on our website, tipsytolstoy.com.
You'll hear from us again soon.